The first thing he noticed was the smell. Rancid oil and the stench of mice. Straw pricked his back through the fabric of his coveralls. Daniel Rayburn opened his eyes and saw the holy roof. The gray sky peered through the cracks in the boards. He tried to take a deeper breath, and his ribs responded with a dull ache. But the pain didn't feel right. It was too faint. A second ago, he was falling. A second ago, the ground was rushing toward him at 200 knots. A second ago, the fuel pump had failed 7 minutes into the test flight, and now he was lying on straw, smelling of mice. Dan slowly sat up. He felt his ribs. Everything was in place. He looked at his hands. His own. The same scrape on the knuckle of his right hand. Yesterday, he'd been unscrewing a nut on the test stand and scraped the skin off. Yesterday. Or whenever. He looked up, and then a shadow fell over the shed. Something enormous glided across the sky through the hole in the roof. Long, 40 meters, with reddish scales that shimmered like copper in the morning light. Its wings moved slowly and lazily, like a fish in an aquarium. A dragon. A real, living dragon was gliding through the sky above his head. Dan didn't scream. He didn't crawl away. He just watched as the shadow slid across the dirt floor of the shed and moved on. The dragon didn't dive. It didn't lose altitude. It paid no attention to the shed below. So Dan wasn't the target. That meant he had time. He stood up. His legs held him steady. His head was clear. That was what scared him the most. He had just died. He remembered it. The field of sunflowers rushing toward him, a voice on the radio, the last words he'd managed to say. Altitude, roll, and a request to tell his wife about the blueprint in the top drawer. And then nothing. And now straw, the barn, the dragon. Dan looked around. In the corner stood a blacksmith's forge, an old, cracked one. Next to it were rusty tongs and an anvil covered in scale. He walked over and ran his finger along the metal. The steel was poor quality, porous, but it was iron. And where there's iron, there's smelting. Where there's smelting, there's heat. Where there's heat, there's everything else. He looked up again. The dragon had flown away long ago, but its shadow seemed to linger, on the floor, on the walls, on everything his eyes could see beyond the barn's threshold. Dan stepped outside. The city lay before him in terraces. Houses clung to the mountainside. Down in the valley, the chimneys of blacksmith shops were smoking. Higher up, the tiled roofs of the wealthier homes glistened. Even higher still, the white walls of something resembling a palace gleamed. And above it all hung the sky, a vast, unfamiliar sky in which he could make out 2 more dots, 2 more dragons, far away. They circled above the horizon like hawks over a field, only the field was an entire kingdom. Dan stood in the doorway of the barn and watched those dots. His mind was already working. He couldn't turn it off. 34 years. 10 years at the design bureau. Hundreds of hours poring over blueprints. Dozens of machines taken apart and put back together. He'd seen birds fly. He'd calculated the lift generated by a wing. He knew why an airplane stays in the air and why it falls. And now, looking at these creatures in the sky, he could think of only one thing. Their bones are hollow. Otherwise, such a mass couldn't take off. Their wingspan is at least 20 meters. That means the load on the wing is enormous. That means they can't maneuver sharply. That means they can be outflanked in a turn. His hands were trembling, not from fear, from what his mind was already picturing. Fuselage, wing, tail, 3 parts, engine, wing, controls. If there's iron and fire in this world, then he has everything he needs. All he needed was a year. A woman walked down the street with a basket on her head. She saw him and stopped. She stared at his overalls, at his boots, at his face. Dan realized he looked like an alien here, because he was an alien. The woman said something. He didn't understand a word. The language was foreign. But then the words suddenly began to come together, slowly, as if someone were turning a tuning knob inside his head. A minute later, he was already making out individual words: stranger, workshop, blacksmith. The woman was asking who he was and where he was from. Dan answered with the first thing that came to mind. He said he was a craftsman, that he worked with metal, that he was looking for work. The woman looked at him skeptically, but pointed down the slope. She said that's where the blacksmith's row was. They always needed extra hands there. Dan nodded and headed downhill. The town was called Vallenheim. He learned this an hour later as he wandered the streets, listening to the foreign speech that became clearer with every passing minute. Vallenheim, the capital of a kingdom sandwiched between the three dragon houses, Ash, Storm, and Azure. Three clans of winged creatures that divided the sky just as earthly kings divide rivers. Anything that flies higher than 100 meters pays tribute. Caravans on griffins carry gold. Mages who can summon the wind pay with their own blood. And simple villages give up their livestock. The Celestial Tithe, that's what it was called. Dan listened and took it all in. He was sitting in a cheap tavern by the lower gate, eating something that looked like porridge with lard. He paid for his meal with labor. He helped the owner repair a hinge on the door. The owner looked at his hands and said they were good hands, skilled, but strange, too clean for a blacksmith. Dan said nothing. He was thinking. The crisis had begun 3 years ago. A young dragon of the House of Ash named Warren Cat demanded a redrawing of the borders. He burned 2 port cities on the coast. He accused them of insolence. They'd started building tall masts there, and that offended him. Anything that rises toward the sky belongs to the dragons. That was the law, unwritten but absolute. The kingdom couldn't pay anymore. There was nothing left to fight with. There was nowhere to run. The sky was everywhere. And in that sky, there were masters. Dan finished his porridge. He wiped his hands on the leg of his overalls. He stood up. He needed to get into the palace. Not because he wanted power or protection, but because the palace had resources, metal, people, money. Without these, he couldn't build anything, and he intended to build. Because Daniel Rayburn had spent his whole life building machines that fly. And now, standing in a foreign world under a foreign sky full of foreign dragons, he felt a strange sensation. Not fear, not despair, but an itch in his fingers. That very itch that appeared every time he saw a challenge, when he saw a problem that could be solved. And the solution was already taking shape in his mind. Rough, primitive, made of wood, iron, and rags. But it would work. Because the laws of physics don't change. Lift is lift. A wing profile is a wing profile. Even here. Even beneath the dragons. He made his way up the slope, toward the palace. Dan reached the palace gates by evening. The guards wouldn't let him past the threshold. 2 burly men in chainmail looked at his overalls and decided he was a vagrant. One of them said they were currently recruiting craftsmen at the palace, some decree from the queen. But craftsmen had to come with a recommendation from a guild, and Dan had neither a recommendation nor a guild, not even proper clothes. Dan didn't argue. He went back down to the lower city and found the row of blacksmith shops. 6 workshops stood in a row along the dirty street. Smoke billowed from each one, and the pounding of hammers blended into a single rhythm. He walked into the one at the end. The master was young, about 25, broad-shouldered with a scarred left hand. His name was Thorn. Dan said he was looking for work. Thorn looked at his hands and asked what he could do. Dan picked up a piece of coal from the table and drew a gear on the wall, a proper one, with an involute tooth profile. Thorn looked at the drawing and said nothing. Then he asked what it was. Dan said it was a wheel that meshed with another wheel just like it and transmitted force without loss. Thorn said he'd seen gears on watermills, but they were crude. Square teeth, they'd break after a season. Dan nodded and said they broke because the tooth shape was wrong. If the tooth is shaped like this, he said, drawing a line, the gears will roll over each other instead of grinding. Thorn was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd take him on for a week. If Dan proved himself useful within a week, he'd stay. If not, he'd move on. Dan agreed. For 3 days he worked with the hammer. He shaped the blanks. He drew out the strips. Thorne watched him and frowned. Dan's hands were skilled, but not those of a blacksmith. He held the hammer correctly, but without practice. Instead, he did something else. He measured everything in sight. He carved a ruler out of wood, marking it with charcoal. He made a primitive square out of 2 iron strips fastened together with a rivet, and he began measuring every part that Thorne made. Thorne was angry. He said that a master works by eye, not with a stick. Dan didn't argue. He simply showed Thorne 2 horseshoes from the same batch. One was 3 millimeters wider than the other. Thorne said that was normal. Dan said it was normal only if the second part was exactly the same as the first, because if you make 10 swords and each one is different, you have to start over 10 times. But if you make 10 identical parts, you can replace any one of them and the mechanism will keep working. Thorne fell silent, deep in thought. On the 5th day, Dan made a vernier caliper, a rough one, made of wood with iron jaws, but it worked. Thorne looked at this tool as if it were magic. Dan showed him how to use it. Thorne tried it. He measured a piece of wood, then he measured another. The difference was visible, obvious, indisputable. Thorne said just one word: more. He wanted another tool like that for his apprentice. On the 6th day, a well-dressed man walked into the workshop, a blue caftan, a silver buckle on his belt. He said he was looking for craftsmen for the palace workshop by the Queen's decree. Officially to decorate the palace, new lamps, grills, forged metalwork. Thorne said he was busy, but he did have an apprentice, a strange one, but skilled. The man in blue looked at Dan, at his overalls, which were already dirty and scorched in 2 places, at the vernier caliper in his hands. He asked what it was. Dan explained. The man touched the tool, turned it over in his hands, looked at the scale scratched into the wood, and told Dan to come to the palace's west gate tomorrow morning. Dan arrived. They led him across the courtyard, past the barracks and stables, past warehouses that smelled of wood and oil, down a stone staircase to the basement level. There was a workshop there, a large one, 3 forges, 2 annals, shelves full of tools, and 5 men who looked at him without any friendliness. The head of the workshop was Halvar, an old man of about 60, a gray beard down to his waist, arms like 2 ham hocks, the royal armorer. He had been forging swords for the royal guard for 40 years and considered himself the finest master in Valenheim. And he was right. His swords never broke. His arrowheads pierced chainmail at 30 paces. His crossbows shot 400 paces, and that was as far as they could go. That's exactly what he told Dan. He showed him the crossbow. Heavy, beautiful, deadly. He said it was the best weapon on the continent and that the laws of physics wouldn't allow for anything further. Dan silently picked up a piece of paper from the table. He tore off a strip. He folded a paper airplane, an ordinary one, a child's paper airplane, and he launched it across the entire hall. The paper airplane flew 60 meters. It glided smoothly and landed at the feet of a woman standing at the far end of the hall. Dan didn't know she was standing there. He hadn't seen her when he launched it, but the paper airplane landed right at her feet. The hall fell silent. The woman was short. Her dark hair was held back by a simple silver headband. She had gray eyes and a tired face, beautiful in a way that comes not from youth, but from intelligence. Queen Regent Myre Valenheim. She looked at the paper airplane at her feet as if it were a dragon's severed head. Then she raised her eyes to Dan. He was standing at the other end of the hall, dirty, in a scorched jumpsuit, with hands smeared with coal. And he said softly, "It weighs nothing. It has no bowstring. It has no mage. It's just the right shape." The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Halvar opened his mouth to say something contemptuous, but the queen raised her hand and he fell silent. Myre leaned forward. She picked up the paper airplane. She twirled it between her fingers. She looked at the folds, at the symmetry, at how the paper had been folded. Then she looked at Dan again and asked how many people he needed. The Queen gave him 5. Halvar, who didn't want this, 2 of Halvar's apprentices who only listened to the old man, a young carpenter named Gren who had skilled hands but a bad temper, and a girl, a wind mage named Ilara Tainwind, 26 years old, dark hair tied in a knot at the nape of her neck, angry eyes. She had been officially assigned to keep an eye on the stranger from another world. Unofficially, she was supposed to report his every word to the Queen. Ilara hated this assignment. She was a wind mage. She controlled air currents. Every time she stirred up a wind strong enough to knock a person off their feet, she would spend the next 2 days lying in bed, coughing up blood. That was the price. Magic in Aerodyn came at a high cost. The most powerful air mage could lift a wagon into the air for 10 minutes. Afterward, he'd cough up blood for a week. Ilara wasn't the most powerful, but she was stubborn, and she knew for certain that true flight could only be achieved through pain, through sacrifice, through a mage's blood spilled into the sky, not through some paper toys. She told Dan this on the very first day, right to his face. He nodded and said he understood her point of view. Then he asked her to conjure a breeze, a small one, just a stream of air in one direction, 5 meters per second. She raised an eyebrow. She asked why. He said he wanted to test something. She snorted, but did as he asked. The wind blew steady and straight along the workshop. Dan picked up a thin wooden slat, flat, and held it horizontally in the current. The slat didn't budge. Then he tilted the front edge up slightly. The strip shot upward from his fingers. Ilara blinked. Dan picked up the strip from the floor. He said that was lift. Air flows over the top surface faster than under the bottom. The pressure above drops. The pressure below is higher. It pushes the strip upward. F. Physics, not magic. Ilara said it was nonsense and left. But she came back the next day, and the day after that, too. Dan started with measurements. For the first 3 days, he did nothing but teach people how to measure. A ruler, a set square, vernier calipers. He made 5 sets out of wood and iron. He checked every tool personally. Halvar watched this with outright contempt. He said that a true master works with his eye and a hammer, not with these toys for children. Dan didn't argue. He asked Halvar to forge 2 identical strips. Halvar forged them. Dan measured them. The difference was 4 millimeters. He showed Halvar. Halvar flushed and said that 4 millimeters was nothing. Dan said that for a sword, it was nothing. For a wing, it was death. Halvar asked which wing. Dan said he'd show him soon. Halvar spat and walked away to his forge. The first month was hell. Dan drew blueprints, lots of them, with charcoal on boards, on scraps of leather, on the walls. Halvar pointedly ignored them. One of the apprentices, named Rolt, once wiped away a drawing with a rag, saying the wall was dirty. Dan redrew it in silence. Rolt wiped it away again. Dan redrew it a 3rd time. The 4th time, Rolt swung the rag at him, and Dan grabbed his arm, not roughly, but firmly. He looked him in the eye and said quietly, "These lines will save your life someday. Don't erase them." Rolt flinched, but something in Dan's voice stopped him. He walked away and never touched the drawings again. By the 2nd month, Dan began building an engine. Not a gasoline engine. There was no gasoline in this world. There was alcohol. Alchemists distilled it for their own needs, but an alcohol-powered internal combustion engine was a challenge for another time. First, steam. Simple and straightforward. A boiler, a cylinder, a piston, a connecting rod, a flywheel. Dan knew how a steam engine worked, not from a textbook. When he was 12, he'd taken apart a model of Watt's steam engine at the Technical Museum with his own 2 hands. He remembered it forever. The problem was the materials. The steel here was coarse, porous. It didn't hold pressure well. Dan spent a week wandering around the lower city and talking to blacksmiths. One of them, an old man named Irvin, worked with a special kind of ore, heavy and dark. When Dan asked where it came from, Irvin said it was from the mines up north. The ore produced steel that was denser and less porous. Dan asked for a sample. He tested it using the simplest method. He heated it until it glowed red, plunged it into water, listened to the sound, and examined the fracture. The steel was better than what Halvar had used, not by much, but enough. He ordered 20 kilograms from Irvan. He paid from the purse he'd been given by decree of the queen. The purse was nearly empty. The queen trusted him, but not enough to let him spend much. For the next 3 weeks, the workshop clanged, rumbled, and stank. Dan was forging a cylinder. Halvar didn't help, but he didn't. He stood to the side and watched. Gren, the carpenter, carved out the wooden parts of the casing. The apprentices handled the small details, rivets, fasteners, and gaskets. Ilara came every day. She sat in the corner. She watched. She was silent. Sometimes she asked what it was. Dan explained, briefly, without unnecessary words. Cylinder, piston, connecting rod. Steam pushes on the piston pushes the connecting rod turns the crankshaft turns whatever you want. Ilara listened with the expression of someone who doesn't believe a single word but can't stop listening. By the end of the second month, the engine was ready. Ugly. 2 cylinders, a copper boiler the size of a barrel, iron tubes joined with a tolerance of plus or minus 1.5 millimeters. For this world, that was cosmic precision. For Dan, it was a disgrace. But a working man's disgrace. He poured water into the boiler. He lit a fire beneath it. The workshop gathered around. Even Halvar came over. 10 minutes later, the water boiled. Steam rushed through the tubes. The piston twitched. Once, twice, 3 times. The flywheel swayed and began to turn. Slowly, with a terrifying screech. But it was turning. The engine was running. 7 minutes. In the 7th minute, the gasket between the cylinder and the pipe gave way. Steam burst out to the side. There was a loud bang. Everyone jumped back. The engine stopped. Dan stood in front of it, staring at the wet remains of the gasket. Then he turned toward the workshop. All 5 of them were looking at him. Halvar looked sour. The apprentices looked frightened. Gren looked interested. Ilara looked something like she was in shock. Dan said one thing. So, 8 minutes next time. It took 3 weeks to assemble the second engine. Dan redesigned the gasket. Instead of grease-soaked leather, he used a copper plate with a thin layer of clay fired into ceramic. Fragile, but it held the pressure better. Halvar helped for the first time, not because he believed in it, but because Dan asked him to forge a part of a specific shape, and Halvar couldn't resist the challenge. The part was complicated, a connecting rod with 2 lugs. Halvar fiddled with it all day. Then he showed the result. Dan measured it with a vernier caliper. The deviation was less than a millimeter, for the first time. Halvar looked at the caliper and at his creation. Then he asked if he could make himself a tool like that. Dan said, of course. He helped him. They spent the evening on it, talking about nothing but metal and tolerances. It was the first evening Halvar hadn't looked at him like an enemy. The second engine ran for 22 minutes. It didn't explode. It just stopped when the water in the boiler ran out. It had enough power to turn a wooden wheel, not enough to lift anything into the air. But Dan had no intention of getting the engine airborne. Not yet. He needed a glider, a wing, without an engine. Because before flying with an engine, he had to prove that the wing's shape worked, that lift existed, that the laws of aerodynamics applied in this world just as they did in his. He began building the glider at the start of the 3rd month. The frame was made of ash. Gren was thrilled. Finally, some wood, his element. He cut the ribs according to a template that Dan had drawn on a board. The wing profile, flat on the bottom, convex on top, classic. Dan explained every curve to Gren. Gren listened. He didn't understand, but he cut precisely. The covering was made of fabric, thick canvas soaked in linseed oil. Halvar grumbled that it wasn't a weapon but a toy, but he attached the ribs conscientiously. The glider turned out small. Its wingspan was 4 meters. It weighed as much as a grown man. Dan knew there wouldn't be a pilot for the first test flights. First, they had to test it without a person on board. He found a hill outside town, gentle, with a good runway. On the day of the test, the whole workshop gathered. Halvar, Gren, both apprentices, and Alara, who pretended she'd just happened to drop by. Dan tied a rope to the glider. He tied 2 burly guys from the lower town to the rope, paying each a copper coin. He explained that they needed to run down the slope and pull. The plan was simple: a running start, speed, air flows over the wing, lift overcomes weight, the glider takes off. The pullers keep running and the glider flies on the rope like a kite, only heavier. The guys ran, the rope tightened, the glider jerked, it rolled across the grass, and after 10 meters, it broke free from the ground. 1 meter, 2 meters. It rose and hovered at a height of 3 meters. The rope hummed. The guys ran. The glider flew, smoothly, straight, without any jerks. Dan stood on the hill and watched. He'd seen thousands of flights, on a screen, at the airfield, through the cockpit window. But this flight was different, because he had built this wing out of ash wood, canvas, and iron rivets in a world where people didn't know what an airfoil was. And it was flying. 200 meters. Then the rope ran out, the guys stopped, and the glider landed gently on the grass, in one piece. The workshop fell silent. Gren opened his mouth and closed it again. Halvar crossed his arms over his chest. The apprentices exchanged glances. Alara stood apart. Her face was impassive. Dan turned to her and asked her to do one thing: to create an updraft, a small one, just under the wing, just to test one of his ideas. He said that if she was right, and all this was nonsense, the wind wouldn't change a thing. If he was right, the glider would fly farther and higher. Alara was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she'd do it only to prove he was a charlatan. She stepped forward, closed her eyes, raised her arms. Dan saw how the air around her changed. The grass bent, dust swirled up. He didn't feel anything magical. He felt the wind, an ordinary wind, just rising upward. A thermal, an updraft. They launched the glider again. This time the guys didn't even make it 30 meters. The glider shot upward. The rope tightened like a string. 5 meters, 10, 15. He was rising quickly, and the rope wouldn't let him go any further. One of the guys fell. The second let go of the rope. The glider broke free and soared upward. No thrust, no engine, just on Alara's updraft. 20 meters, 30. He was gliding, turning in the current. The wings swayed slightly. Dan held his breath. Then Alara lowered her arms. She was tired. The current weakened. The glider banked. It began to descend. It glided through the air and landed in the grass 200 meters from the hill. It was a hard landing. One strut cracked, but the wing was intact. Dan ran toward it. The others followed him. He inspected the damage. A strut, a minor thing, fixable in a day. The wing was intact. The skin was intact. The fasteners held. He turned to the team and smiled. Alara wasn't smiling. She stood there, her face pale, staring at the glider. Dan could see she was breathing heavily. The wind was costing her blood, literally. The corner of her mouth was red. But she wasn't looking at her hands. She was looking at the wing's profile, at that very same convex upper surface that Dan had sketched on the board a week ago. She didn't say a word. She turned around and walked back to the city, in silence, the whole way. Dan didn't chase after her. He knew that look on her face. He'd seen it on young engineers' faces when they first realized that something they'd believed in their whole lives didn't work the way they thought it did. It wasn't anger, it was a shift in perspective. It hurt, but afterward, a person becomes stronger. That evening, he sat alone in the workshop. He was adjusting the glider's strut. A figure appeared in the doorway. Small, skinny, blonde hair, big eyes that glowed in the light of the oil lamp. A girl of about 16. She looked at the glider, at the blueprints on the walls, at the engine sitting in the corner. Then she looked at Dan and asked how it worked. Dan asked who she was. She said her name was Celia. Dan asked, "Celia who?" She said, "Celia Vallenheim, the Queen's sister, a princess." She stood in the doorway of the workshop in a simple dress, without any jewelry, and with an ink stain on her finger. Dan looked at the stain, then at her eyes, then at the glider, and said, "Sit down, I'll tell you." Celia came every evening. At first, Dan thought it was just a princess's whim. "It's boring in the palace. I want adventure." But on the third day, she brought a notebook, a thick one, a leather-bound one, filled with tiny handwriting. She wrote down everything he told her, and she didn't just write it down. She asked questions that made Dan pause and think. Why is the wing profile shaped exactly like this? Why isn't it thicker? Why isn't it thinner? What would happen if the wing were triangular? What would happen if the tips were bent upward? She was 16 years old and had never seen an airplane, but she thought like an engineer. Dan realized this on the 5th day when she drew a diagram of the landing gear in her notebook. He hadn't explained the landing gear to her. She figured out on her own that the airframe needed something to roll on the ground before takeoff, and she drew it, roughly, but fundamentally correct. 3 wheels, 2 under the wings, 1 under the nose. Dan looked at her drawing and, for the first time in a long while, felt something other than his engineer's itch. Something warm. Hope, perhaps. Because if there are minds like this girl's in this world, then this world has a chance. He pulled out from under the workbench a set of tools he'd made for himself. Small, precise. A screwdriver, a file, wire cutters, pliers, all with wooden handles. He set them down in front of Celia. He told her they were hers, her own. Starting tomorrow, she'll be an apprentice, if the Queen allows it. Celia picked up the screwdriver. She looked at the handle. Her initials were burned into it, S.V. Dan had done it that morning, just in case. Celia clutched the screwdriver with both hands. She lowered her head. Her shoulders began to shake. Dan turned away and pretended to be busy with a drawing. A minute later, she wiped her face with her sleeve and said that the Queen would allow it. She did allow it. Not right away. Murray summoned Dan the next day. The conversation was brief and harsh. The Queen asked what he was doing with her sister. Dan said he was teaching her. Murray asked what. Dan said building. Murray looked at him with the long, heavy gaze of a woman who had been wearing a crown on her head and holding her 8-year-old daughter in her arms for 3 years, and who trusted no one. Then she said that if anything happened to Celia, she would personally cut out his heart with a dagger. No metaphors. Dan nodded. He said he understood. And he added one thing. He said that Celia was the most talented person he'd met since arriving here. That she thought not like a craftsman, but like a designer, and that in 5 years she'd know more than he did. Murray was silent. Then she nodded. Celia became part of the workshop. Halvar grumbled that women had no place at the forge. Celia looked at him with her huge eyes and asked if he could teach her how to temper steel. Halvar opened his mouth, closed it, and silently showed her how to hold the tongs. By the end of the 3rd month, the workshop had begun to change, slowly, imperceptibly, but it was changing. Halvar still grumbled, but now he grumbled about the parts he was making from Dan's blueprints. Not because he believed in flying machines, but because every blueprint was a challenge to his craftsmanship. Gren worked quickly and cheerfully. He found something in working with wood for the glider that he hadn't found in ordinary carpentry: precision. The apprentices, Rolt and Weiser, still gave Dan the side eye, but they no longer tore up the blueprints. Ilara came by every day. She sat in the corner, she took notes, and more often she asked questions. Not hostile ones, genuine ones. She wanted to understand why air flows around a wing profile in just that way. One day, Dan picked up a stick and drew Bernoulli's equation in the sand outside the workshop, the simplest one. Pressure plus half the density times the square of the velocity equals a constant. Ilara looked at those symbols as if they were a spell. Then she said that if that were true, then all the magic of the wind was simply a difference in pressure. Dan said yes. In a way, yes. Ilara left and didn't come back for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she returned, with red eyes. Dan didn't ask why. He gave her some work to do. He sat her down next to him and began to explain how the wind behaves at different altitudes, how updrafts form, how to use them without magic. Ilara listened, and for the first time ever, she didn't argue. At the beginning of the 4th month, a new person appeared in the workshop. A short woman, about 22 years old, quiet, with a round face and attentive eyes. She brought in a pot of soup and said the queen had sent a cook so the masters could eat properly instead of just crackers and water. Her name was Yuna Pak. Dan accepted this without question. The soup was hot, thick, with meat and some herbs that filled the workshop with a scent that made Halvar's stomach growl. Yuna cooked in silence. She cleaned up in silence. She watched everything with her quiet eyes. Dan noticed something on the 3rd day. Yuna knew who was tired. She would set out an extra bowl of soup specifically for the one who had worked the longest. She noticed when Gren was starting to get angry and brought him water before he lost his temper. She remembered the names of everyone who came into the workshop, and the smells. Once, Dan was soldering a copper tube with solder he'd made himself. Yuna walked over and said that the solder smelled wrong. Dan stopped. He sniffed. He didn't smell anything. Yuna said there was something extra in it, something bitter. Dan checked. She was right. There was an impurity in the tin, a minor one, but under high pressure the joint might not have held. Dan looked at Yuna. She was standing in front of him with her little pot and a rag, staring at her feet. He asked how she knew about smells. She said it ran in her family of herbalists, that she'd been distinguishing plants by their scent her whole life. Dan nodded, and from that day on, he began asking for her opinion, about materials, about people, about which workers weren't performing well that day. Yuna answered quietly, briefly, and precisely. Halvar said that any foreman who asked a cook for advice had completely lost his mind. Dan said that the cook had just saved his job and a month's worth of work. Halvar fell silent. By the end of the 4th month, the workshop had become something else. Not quite a team yet, but no longer a motley crew of outsiders. Halvar still called Dan an outsider, but now he said the word without malice. Ilara still argued, but now she argued on the merits of the issue. Celia was soaking up knowledge at a pace that took Dan's breath away. Yuna fed them all and quietly kept the workshop running. Gren was planning the ribs and whistling, and one evening, Dan stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked up at the sky. 2 dots were circling high above the city. Dragons. A patrol. They didn't know that down below, in the palace basement, stood a wooden frame with canvas wings and a steam engine that ran for 22 minutes. They didn't know that a man from another world was teaching a princess to calculate lift. They didn't know that the old gunsmith had, for the first time in his life, made a part with a precision of 1 millimeter. They knew nothing, and Dan thought that was good. Let them not know, for now. The 5th month began with a failure. Dan had assembled the motor glider, a steam engine mounted on the glider's frame, a wooden propeller, 2 cylinders, a boiler filled with water. The whole thing weighed as much as 2 grown men and looked like any aircraft designer's worst nightmare. But it was supposed to fly, in theory. In practice, on the very first day of testing, the wooden propeller shattered into pieces 3 minutes into operation. Dan stood in front of the wreckage and ran the numbers in his head. The problem wasn't the propeller's shape. The shape was correct. The problem was the wood. Ash couldn't withstand the centrifugal force at those RPMs. He needed a different material, stronger, lighter, ideally metal. But a metal propeller would weigh too much for this engine. Dan thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came to the workshop and said he needed bone. Halvar looked at him as if he were crazy. Dan explained. In this world, there were griffins, big ones, and flying creatures have bones that are hollow yet strong. He asked where he could get griffin bones. Halvar said that griffin bones were sold at the market in the lower city. They were used to make handles for expensive knives. Dan went down to the market. He found a bone merchant. He bought 4 large griffin shin bones. Each was an elbow's length long, white, lightweight, hard as stone. He brought them to the workshop and laid them on the workbench. Halvar felt them. He shook his head. He said that bone couldn't be forged. Dan said there was no need to forge it. It needed to be cut, sharpened, polished, and glue them together. For 3 days, he and Celia experimented. Celia figured out how to saw the bone lengthwise with a thin saw that Gren had made from a strip of steel. The result was long plates, light, flexible, strong. Dan gathered the plates and began gluing them together to form blades. Una prepared the glue from a fish bladder and some herbs she knew from her past life as an herbalist. The glue held like a rock. The new propeller was half as heavy as a wooden one and 3 times as strong. It held up for 10 minutes at full speed without a single crack. Halvar watched the spinning propeller made of griffin bone and shook his head. Then he said he never thought he'd be making weapons out of junk. Dan said it wasn't junk. It was material. And in engineering, there's no such thing as junk. There are only things that haven't found a use yet. The 6th month. The motor glider had been rebuilt, a new propeller, reinforced frame, an improved double-walled boiler. Dan decided it was time. He would pilot it himself. He wouldn't trust anyone else with it, not because he didn't trust people, but because if the machine were to kill someone, let it kill its creator. That's only fair. On the morning of the 6th month and the 4th day of his stay in Aerodyn, Dan took the motor glider out to the same field outside the city. It was early morning. Fog was creeping across the grass. There was almost no wind. Perfect conditions. The whole workshop showed up. Halvar, Gren, Rolt, and Weiser, Celia, whom Mire had let go after an hour-long argument, Una with a thermos of hot herbal tea, and Alara, who, for the first time ever, had come not as an observer, but as a participant. She stood off to the side. Dan walked over to her and asked if she could maintain the thrust if he asked her to. Not for takeoff, just as a backup, in case something went wrong and the machine started to fall. Alara looked at him for a long time. Then she said she could, but it would cost her 3 days in bed. Dan said he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He climbed into the cockpit. Calling it a cockpit was a stretch. A wooden seat, 2 rudder pedals, a control stick, a rough leather shoulder strap. In front of him stood a kettle with water already boiling. Tubes jetted out on the right. On the left was the steam control lever. He pulled the lever. Steam poured out. The pistons began to rattle. The propeller spun. The motor glider jerked. It rolled across the grass, slowly, then faster. The grass flashed by under the wheels. Dan kept track, speed, distance, pressure on the pedals. The wings began to lift. He could feel it. That very moment when the machine stops being a cart and starts being an airplane. When the wheels become lighter, when the air begins to carry it. He pulled the control stick toward him, gently, by 2 fingers. The nose rose. The shaking stopped. The wheels lifted off the ground. 1 meter, 2, 3, 5. He was flying. The motor glider was gaining altitude slowly, with a creak. With the roar of the steam engine, smoke billowed from the exhaust pipe, leaving a white trail in its wake. Dan initiated a gentle left turn. The machine obeyed. Heavily, with a lag, but it obeyed. He began circling over the field. Below, he saw 6 figures, 6 people who had tilted their heads back. He saw Celia jumping and waving her arms, Halvar standing motionless with his arms crossed, Ilara standing apart, her hair ruffled by the oncoming wind. He flew over them at a height of 30 meters. He turned around. He began a second circle. On the second circle, the engine coughed. The steam pressure was dropping. The water was running out. Dan didn't take any chances. He cut off the steam supply. He switched the aircraft to gliding mode. He descended in a straight line. He leveled off. The ground rose to meet him. Impact. The wheels bounced. The landing gear creaked. The motor glider skidded 10 meters across the grass and came to a stop. Dan was sitting in the cockpit, unharmed, alive. His hands were shaking, not from fear. He climbed out of the cockpit. His legs felt like cotton. Celia was the first to run up to him. She was shouting something incoherent and grabbing his sleeve. Behind her came Gren, his face that of a man who had witnessed a miracle. Rolt and Weiser stood rooted to the spot. Una cried quietly, her hands pressed to her face. Halvar walked slowly. He stopped in front of Dan. He looked up at him. Then he said one word. Master. For the first time, without irony, without malice, just Master. Dan nodded. He turned toward the field. He looked up at the sky. There were no dragons in sight. The morning fog hid the horizon. But they were there, somewhere. And now the people had something they hadn't had before. Proof. Proof that a person could take to the sky without magic. No blood, no sacrifice, just the right design and a pair of wings. Ilara was the last to approach. She didn't say anything. She just stood nearby and looked at the motor glider, at the broken strut, at the canvas wings, at the propeller made of griffin bone, which was still slowly spinning by inertia. Then she quietly said she needed to think it over, and she left. Dan knew she'd come back. He already knew it. The news reached the palace that same day. Queen Mire summoned Dan to see her that evening, not to the throne room, to her private study. A small room on the palace's upper terrace, maps on the walls, candles, the scent of wax and ink. Mire sat at the table and looked at Dan the way people look when they've been waiting 3 years for just anything and got what they were waiting for. She asked if he could build a machine that would fly to the dragon. Dan said he could, but not tomorrow, and not in a month either. He needed at least half a year to build a real combat machine. Mire asked what real meant. Dan explained. What had flown today was a proof of concept. It was slow, fragile. It carried no weapons. It couldn't handle a maneuver. He needed a different machine, faster, stronger, armed, and with an engine that runs on liquid fuel, not steam. Mire asked what kind of fuel. Dan said alcohol. Alcohol with additives. Mire nodded. She said they'd find the alcohol. The Alchemists Guild distills it by the barrel for their own purposes. She'd order it to be redirected. Then she fell silent. It was a long silence. The candle crackled. The shadow of the flame flickered on the wall. Then Mire said something Dan hadn't expected. She said her husband had died 3 years ago, when Warrencat burned down the port of Kalen. Her husband had been there. He was trying to organize an evacuation. He shielded 2 children with his body when the dragon flew low overhead. The children survived. He didn't. She said this in an even voice, without tears. The tears had run dry 2 years ago. She said she had sworn to him that she would protect the kingdom, and for 3 years she had watched it burn. She paid tribute. She bowed. She smiled at the envoys of the dragon houses. She hated herself every night. And now some man in a scorched jumpsuit is launching paper airplanes and building flying carts. And she's supposed to believe this is salvation? Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he didn't make any grand speeches. He didn't promise victory. He took a small object out of his pocket and placed it on the table, a brass disc the size of a coin, with a hinged lid. He flipped the lid open. Inside was a needle, not a compass. It didn't point north. It pointed toward the door. Dan said it wasn't a compass. It was a beacon. The other half was with Celia. The needle always points to its other half. He said he'd made it from spare parts. A magnet, fine-tuned, simple physics. He said it was so Mireille would always know where her sister was, even when she's at the council, even when she's in the workshop, even when everything around her is on fire. Mireille picked up the round box. She opened it. She closed it. The needle swayed and pointed at the door again. Behind that door, somewhere in the palace wing, Celia was sleeping. Mireille closed the lid, clenched it in her fist, looked at Dan. And for the first time during the entire conversation, her expression changed. Not a smile, not tears, something in between. She said she'd give him anything he asked for. People, metal, money, workshops, everything. Dan nodded and left. Ilara was standing in the hallway. She was waiting for him. Dan wasn't surprised. Ilara said she wanted to understand, not to believe it, to understand. She said she'd paid for the sky with her blood her whole life. Every flight had cost her her health. And now he comes along and says the sky can be had for free, just by carving a tree into the right shape. She said that if that were true, then her whole life had been a lie. Dan said no, her life wasn't a lie. Her power was real. Her sacrifices were real. It's just that now there's another way, a way that doesn't require blood. And these two paths aren't enemies. They can work together. Ilara asked how. Dan said he needed an aerodynamicist, someone who understands the wind, not through formulas, with her body, with her skin. She understands the wind better than any device he could build. He offered her a position, not as a spy, not as an observer, as the project's aerodynamicist. Ilara was silent. Then she asked what that meant. Dan said it meant she would decide how a wing should be curved, how the tail should be positioned, where the air would push and where it would let go, that every flight of every machine would carry her knowledge within it, without bloodshed. Ilara stood in the dark corridor of the palace and looked at him. Then she said she agreed. But if he was lying, she would kill him herself, with the wind. Dan said that was fair. From that day on, everything sped up. The queen allocated a second workshop, a large one on the first level of the palace, with windows, good lighting, and access to water and firewood. Dan gathered a team, 10 workers from the lower city, 2 blacksmiths, 3 carpenters, and 1 alchemist named Farron, who knew how to distill alcohol to the right strength and how to make additives. Farron was a skinny, nervous man who was afraid of fire. Dan asked why he'd become an alchemist if he was afraid of fire. Farron said that his father had been an alchemist and his grandfather had been an alchemist, so he'd had no choice. Dan said that now he did have a choice. Farron could leave, or he could stay and help create a fuel that would change the world. Farron stayed. He was a brilliant chemist. 2 weeks later, he delivered the first batch of fuel to Dan. Alcohol blended with essential oils. It burned hotter than pure alcohol and produced more energy per unit of volume. Dan built the first internal combustion engine in 6 weeks. A single-cylinder, air-cooled engine. Small, it ran roughly, it rattled, it smoked, but it turned the crankshaft with a force a steam engine could only dream of. Halvar looked at this engine and, for the first time ever, said it was beautiful. Not the machine, the idea. Dan looked at him and realized that the old man had finally crossed the line. Not because he believed in it, but because he saw craftsmanship. True craftsmanship. Something different, unlike his own, but real. The 9th month. The workshop was running 2 shifts, 20 people. The roar of the hammers didn't let up from dawn to dusk. Dan was building his first real combat machine. He named it Valkyrie. The frame was made of ash, reinforced with steel plates in the areas under the greatest stress. Wings with a span of 7 meters. The profile that Ilara helped select after dozens of tests in a homemade wind tunnel. They built the tunnel out of wooden panels and blacksmith's bellows. Ilara stood at the exit and felt the airflow on her skin. "Faster here," she'd say, "slower there. A vortex in this spot." Dan would adjust the design based on her instructions. Then he verified it with calculations. She was right 9 times out of 10. The skin was made of canvas impregnated with linseed oil and fish glue. The engine was a 2-cylinder alcohol-fueled unit with Farina's additives. It had enough power to propel the craft at a speed of 50 knots, slow by the standards of Dan's world. Impossible to go fast by the standards of this world. Armament. That was a separate point of contention. Halvar insisted on a crossbow, a large one, a heavy one. Dan refused. The crossbow was too heavy. Reloading was too slow. Something lighter and faster was needed. He designed a coarse-firing crossbow. Essentially, it was a multi-shot crossbow with a 10-bolt magazine and a lever-operated reloading mechanism. The pilot pressed the lever with his foot, and the next bolt would fall into place. Halvar forged the bolt heads, steel, armor-piercing, each with 4 facets, each identical, with a vernier caliper. He no longer grumbled about the measurements. In the middle of the 9th month, what Dan had been waiting for and dreading happened. Word got out. One of the workers from the lower city told his wife. His wife told her neighbor. The neighbor told the merchant. The merchant told his supplier from a neighboring city. And the news spread like wildfire. In the capital of Valenheim, they were building a flying machine, without magic, made of wood and iron. Within a week, everyone knew about it. Another week later, word had spread beyond the kingdom's borders. The first spy arrived. Dan didn't recognize him. Yuna did. A new worker, a sturdy fellow. He said he was a blacksmith from the lower city. His hands looked the part. He held a hammer. But that evening, Yuna told Dan that this man didn't smell right. Not like a blacksmith's sweat. Something else. A little sweet. Like the incense they use in the temples of the House of Storms. Dan thanked her. The next day, he spoke with the spy in private. He didn't accuse him. He just said he knew, and that the spy had a choice. To leave and tell his masters what he'd seen, or to stay and work. Honestly. The spy chose to leave. That was to be expected. Next came an assassination attempt. Poisoned wine. Someone had left a bottle by the workshop door, a beautiful one, with a sealed neck, with a note saying it was a gift from a grateful townsman. Dan was already reaching to open it when Yuna snatched the bottle away. She sniffed the cork and said, "Don't drink it." The smell was off, bitter, under the wine. Dan handed the bottle to the palace physician. The physician confirmed it. Poison. A slow-acting one. It would have killed him in 3 days. It would have looked like a fever. Mireille was furious. She stepped up security at the workshop. She posted 2 guards at the door. Dan approached Yuna that evening. She was washing her pot and wouldn't look at him. He told her she'd saved his life. Yuna said she'd just sensed it. He said he wanted to do something for her. 3 days later, he placed a small brass device in front of her, a little cylinder with a lid. Inside was a porous plate impregnated with a compound that changed color upon contact with the major poisons known to the court physician. Dan said it was a tester. She sniffs, and the device shows the result. So she'd have proof, not just her nose. Proof. Yuna took the device. She turned it over in her hands. She ran her finger along the brass side. She looked at Dan. For the first time, he saw her smile. A small, fleeting smile, like a flash. Then she tucked the device into her apron pocket and returned to the cauldron. The assassination attempt meant that the dragon houses already knew. The Ash House, the Storm House, the Azure House. One of them had sent the poisoner. Or someone from a neighboring kingdom. Or all of them together. Dan realized that the time for peaceful work was coming to an end. He needed to speed things up. The Valkyrie had to take flight. Soon. Because the next attack wouldn't be poison. The next attack would be fire. The Valkyrie was ready by the 10th month. Dan spent 3 days on the ground checking every knot, every joint, every rivet. He tugged on the control cables with his hands. He rocked the control sticks. He checked the tension on the struts. He personally started the engine and listened to the cylinders running. Celia helped. She could already read the blueprints and knew what to check. Halvar stood nearby, silently handing him tools. Ilara walked around the field outside town 3 times, on foot, checking the wind, the currents, the direction. She said the morning of the 3rd day would be best. A southwesterly wind, steady, 5 meters per second, perfect for a takeoff heading north. Dan believed her. On the morning of the 3rd day, the entire workshop rolled the Valkyrie out to the field. 20 people pushed it on wooden wheels along the dirt road. The machine was beautiful, not the kind of beauty artists appreciate, but the beauty of function. Every line had a purpose. Every curve of the wing had been calculated. Every strut was positioned exactly where it should be. Dan climbed into the cockpit. He buckled his seatbelt. His hands rested instinctively on the control stick and the throttle lever. His feet were on the rudder pedals. Before him, behind the oily windshield, the propeller glinted. A 2-bladed propeller, made of griffin bone with an iron core. He turned on the ignition. The engine coughed. Again, it started. A roar rolled across the field. Birds took flight from the nearby trees. Dan opened the throttle. The Valkyrie began to roll. Faster, faster. The tail rose. The nose leveled out. The wheels clattered over the bumps. Then the clattering stopped. The wheels left the ground. Dan felt that moment, the transition from a land-based creature to an airborne one. The machine was heavier than a motor glider, but the engine was more powerful too, and the wing was larger, and the airfoil more precise. It flew differently, with more confidence, more stability. He gained altitude, 30 meters, 50, 100. The capital, Vallenheim, spread out below. Terraces of houses, the palace on the upper terrace, the lower city shrouded in the smoke of forges, and beyond, fields, forests, mountains on the horizon. He began a turn, a smooth one. The machine banked. The wing sliced through the air. Ilara stood on the ground, looking up with her head tilted back. Dan could see her tiny figure, a small dot. He flew low over the field, leveled off, gained altitude again. And then he saw it. A dragon, far away, to the northeast. Huge, dark. It was flying toward the capital. Dan knew it wasn't a patrol. Patrols flew in pairs. This one was alone, and it was heading straight for him, gaining altitude like a fighter jet going in for an intercept. Dan gripped the control stick. His mind was racing. Distance, approach speed, time. The dragon was faster in a straight-line flight. Its wingspan was over 20 meters. It weighed several metric tons. The wing loading was enormous. That meant it couldn't maneuver in the horizontal plane like a small aircraft. Dan turned toward the dragon, not away from it, toward it. It went against every instinct, to fly straight toward a creature that was burning cities to the ground. But Dan knew something the dragon didn't. In a head-on attack, the smaller one has the advantage, because a smaller target is harder to hit, and because a smaller machine can turn faster. The dragon saw him. Dan saw the enormous head turn. He saw its eyes lock onto him, that tiny wooden contraption with a whirring propeller. The dragon didn't veer off. It opened its jaws. Dan saw a glow in its throat. Plasma. The dragon's fire. A second. Dan yawed the plane to the right. A sharp turn. The G-force pressed him into his seat. The wing groaned. The struts rattled. The pillar of fire passed 10 meters to his left. The heat scorched the left side of his face through the glass. Dan emerged from the turn behind the dragon's tail. A classic position, the blind spot. The dragon couldn't turn its head back far enough to breathe fire. Its neck was long, but not that long. Dan pressed the self-firing lever with his foot. The bolt fired. Second, third. 2 out of 3 hit their mark. At the base of the wing, where the scales are thinner, where the muscles and tendons lie beneath. The dragon roared. The sound was so loud it made Dan's ears ring. The creature flinched. Its left wing sagged for a split second. Blood. Dark. Almost black. It spurted into the air and splattered onto the Valkyrie's windshield. Dan didn't finish it off. He knew 3 bolts weren't enough to kill the dragon, but enough for it to get the message. Enough for it to remember. The dragon turned around, heavily, losing altitude. Its left wing wasn't working as well. It was flying away, to the northeast, the way it had come. Dan didn't pursue it. He descended. He landed in a field. Hard. The left landing gear leg snapped on impact. The Valkyrie landed on its wing and skidded 10 meters across the grass, dragging a strip of turf behind it. Dan climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His face was red from the burn. His left eye was watering. Everyone ran toward him. Halvar was the first. The old man grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. He was shouting something. Dan couldn't hear him. His ears were ringing. Then the ringing subsided, and he heard. Halvar was shouting that Dan had wounded the dragon. He'd wounded a dragon. For the first time in 300 years, a human had wounded a dragon. The capital didn't sleep that night. The news spread within an hour. People poured into the streets. They looked up at the sky. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Some stood in silence, gazing in the direction the wounded dragon had flown. Dan sat in the workshop, repairing the landing gear strut. Una brought him some burn ointment. Celia wrote down everything he told her about the battle in her notebook, every maneuver, every second. Ilara stood by the wall, saying nothing. Then she said one thing. She said it was Warrencat, young, angry, the very one who burned down 2 cities, the very one who killed the Queen's husband. And he'll be back. After the battle with Warrencat, everything changed. The Queen doubled the funding. The workshop became a factory. 40 workers, 3 furnaces, 2 lathes that Dan designed and Halvar built, a separate workshop for farina and its fuel, a separate workshop for the hull plating, where 10 women sewed and impregnated canvas according to Celia's patterns. Celia had grown over those months, not physically, internally. She no longer asked how, she asked why. Why is this spar here and not 5 centimeters to the left? Why is the angle of attack this much and not 2 degrees greater? She began arguing with Dan, and sometimes she was right. Dan didn't let it show, but inside he was elated. He needed a successor, someone who would carry on if he were killed. Celia was becoming that person. Ilara had become a full-fledged aerodynamicist. She no longer sat in the corner. She stood next to Dan at the drafting table and made corrections. Her sense of the wind was phenomenal. She could sense turbulence that Dan could only calculate. Once, she adjusted the shape of the wingtip. A small change, an upward curve at the very tip. Dan looked at it and froze. They were winglets. She'd come up with winglets intuitively, something that engineers in his world had discovered only after decades of wind tunnel testing. He asked how she'd figured it out. She said she could feel the air flowing down from the wingtip and swirling into a vortex, and that vortex was pulling the wing backward. So she had to keep it from flowing down, so you have to curve it. Dan silently embraced her, the first and only time. She froze. Then she pushed him away, but not hard. At the end of the 11th month, Dan announced recruitment for flight school. 10 spots. The requirements were simple. Weight no more than 60 kilograms, good eyesight, a strong vestibular system, courage. Out of 60 volunteers, he selected 10. 4 of them were women. Halvar said that women don't fight. Dan said that in a fighter jet cockpit, you don't fight. In a fighter jet cockpit, you fly. And women weigh 10 to 15 kilograms less than men. That means more fuel, more ammunition, more time in the air. Halvar didn't know what to say. Of the 4 girls, one stood out right away. Hannah Breyer, 24 years old, short haircut, bold. She spoke in a way that made Halvar blush, and he'd heard it all. Her father was a glider pilot, One of those madmen who'd tried to fly before Dan, on homemade wings, without an engine, without any calculations, on sheer madness and courage. He crashed when Hannah was 10. She saw it. She saw how the ragged wings folded in midair and her father fell 40 meters onto the rocks. Ever since then, she's been more afraid of the ground than the sky. Dan didn't learn this from her, from Yuna. Yuna noticed everything. She told Dan that Hannah never sits on the floor. She doesn't lie down on the ground. She even sleeps on the top bunk. And during training flights, she makes an extra circle before landing, every single time. One extra circle. As if she doesn't want to touch down. As if the ground were the place where people die, and the sky were the place where they live. Dan didn't tell her about it. He didn't offer to help. He didn't feel sorry for her. He just did the math. The Valkyrie's landing speed, the rollout distance, the load on the landing gear. And he rebuilt her personal aircraft. He extended the flaps, added a spoiler, changed the gear ratio on the brake pedals. The landing speed dropped by 15%. Hannah noticed it on her very first flight. She touched down more gently than usual, rolled out and came to a stop. She sat in the cockpit for a long time. Then she got out. She looked at Dan, who was standing at the edge of the runway. She didn't say anything. She walked away. The next day, during a training dogfight, she covered his plane from a simulated intercept. She executed a turn so sharp that when Dan saw it from the ground, he whistled in admiration. Ilara said the girl flew like the wind. Dan said she flew better than the wind. By the end of the first year, Dan had a squadron, 6 planes, 6 pilots. Valkyrie 1 was his personal plane. Valkyrie 2 was Hannah's craft. The remaining 4 were piloted by cadets who had completed the full training course. The craft were identical. That was the main thing. Not unique, not one of a kind, but identical. Any part from one craft could be swapped onto another. At first, Halvar didn't understand why. Then he understood. When Valkyrie -4 broke its wing spar during landing and was already flying again 2 hours later with a spar from the spare kit. In the old world, repairs would have taken a week. In Dan's world, it took 2 hours. Because every part was exactly the same as every other part. Because of the vernier caliper. Because of the tolerances. Because of the system. The Warren cat hadn't returned, yet. But the Queen's intelligence reported that the House of Ash was furious. The young dragon had been wounded, disgraced, by a human machine. He was gathering allies. He was preparing a response. And the response would not be a single raid. The response would be war. Dan knew this, and he was preparing. Every evening he pored over the blueprints for Valkyrie 2, an improved version, faster, stronger, with 2 self-launching missiles instead of 1, with an armored cockpit, with self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't catch fire if hit. The machine had to return. That was his principle, the most important one, unbreakable. Each of his blueprints began with the question, how would the pilot land if everything broke down? Stormhouse struck first, not with dragons, with mercenaries on griffins. 12 riders on combat griffins entered Valenheim's airspace at dawn on the 14th month. The griffins were fast, agile. Each carried a rider armed with a longbow and a bundle of incendiary pots. Their target was the workshops, to burn down the factory, to destroy the machines on the ground, to kill the engineers. The Queen's intelligence service had issued a warning 6 hours earlier. A merchant from a border town had spotted the griffins resting and sent a pigeon. The pigeon arrived at night. Dan scrambled the squadron at 4 in the morning. 6 Valkyries stood on the field in the morning fog. 6 pilots in coverall suits made of ripstop fabric. Hannah was the first in the cockpit. She sat and waited with that calm expression that Dan had already learned to recognize. The face of someone who isn't afraid of what lies ahead. Because what was behind them was worse. Dan gathered them on the field. 6 people, 4 men, 2 women. Hannah and a girl named Lyra, who was a fisherman's daughter and smelled of the sea even inside the cockpit. He told them one thing: "You're faster than them. You're higher than them. Don't engage in close combat. Move through at speed. Fire your crossbows. Head upward. Turn around. Repeat. No duels. No heroics. The machine must return." All 6 nodded. The Griffins appeared an hour after dawn, 12 dots on the eastern horizon. They flew in formation, in a wedge, beautifully, like soldiers. Dan's squadron waited at an altitude of 300 meters. The Valkyries circled in wide figure eights. The engines roared. The Griffins were flying lower, at an altitude of 100 meters. Their riders weren't looking up. They weren't expecting an enemy in the air. They were expecting crossbows on the walls. Hannah attacked first. She sent her machine into a dive, almost vertical. Her speed was increasing. The wind howled through the struts. She cut through the formation of Griffins like a stone through a flock of pigeons. 2 bolts, 2 hits. One Griffin somersaulted. Its rider plummeted downward. A second Griffin limped through the air and began to descend. Hannah soared upward. The Griffins broke formation. They panicked. The riders turned their heads. Where from? What? How? They didn't understand what was happening. They'd never seen anything like it. Dan was second to enter. More carefully, no dive. Horizontally, at full speed. 2 passes, 4 bolts, 1 Griffin wounded. 1 rider knocked from the saddle by a direct hit to the shield. The remaining 4 Valkyries attacked simultaneously. 20 seconds. In 20 seconds, 12 Griffins were reduced to 6. The remaining 6 turned and fled. Not a single one reached the capital. Not a single incendiary pot fell on the rooftops. Not a single Valkyrie suffered a scratch. The squadron landed on the field an hour later, all 6, unscathed. Dan climbed out of the cockpit and counted the planes. 6, all accounted for. Everyone had returned. He closed his eyes and stood there for 10 seconds. Then he opened them and walked over to Hannah. She was standing by her plane, running her fingers over the wing's skin, gently, as if it were a living creature. Dan asked how she was. Hannah turned and said she was fine. Then she said she wanted to tell him something, that he was an idiot, and that she loved him, and that if he didn't answer right now, she'd slap him across the ear. Dan blinked. Hannah stood in front of him, her face flushed and her fists clenched. Her jumpsuit was covered in oil. Her hair was sticking out from under her helmet. She was completely serious. Dan opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said she wasn't an idiot, and that they should continue this conversation somewhere other than the airfield. Hannah snorted. She said she was the one who brought it up, and she'd be the first to forget about it if he dragged his feet. She turned and walked away. Yuna, who was standing at the edge of the field with a thermos, saw everything. She looked at Dan. She shook her head quietly. Dan thought that life in this world was getting harder every day. The victory over the Griffins had shifted the balance of power. The Storm House realized that mercenaries wouldn't work. The Ash House realized it couldn't afford to delay. The Azure House realized a different approach was needed. And that different approach arrived 2 weeks later, in the form of a woman. She came in the evening, alone, without guards, without weapons. Tall, dark hair down to her shoulders, eyes with vertical pupils that she made no effort to hide. Skin that was slightly bluish under certain lighting. Beautiful. The kind of beauty that makes a person forget to breathe. She introduced herself as Siren. She said she was a mediator from the Azure House, that she wanted to talk. The guard reported to the Queen. Mire came in person. She looked at Siren. Siren looked at Mire. The 2 women stood facing each other in the reception hall, and the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mire asked what the Azure House wanted. Siren said that the Azure House wanted to understand, not to fight, not to steal, to understand. What kind of machine it is, how it flies, why, and what Valenheim intends to do with it. Mire said that Valenheim's intentions concerned only Valenheim. Siren smiled and said that there are no borders in the sky, As for the sky, it concerns everyone. Mireille wanted to refuse. Dan asked for 10 minutes, alone. Mireille looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and left. Dan stayed with Siren. He saw her vertical pupils, saw how the light played on her skin, saw that she wasn't human, a half-breed, a half-dragon. He asked her straight out, had she come to steal or to talk? Siren said she'd been sent to steal, but she was interested in talking, because she'd been living between two worlds for 400 years. The dragons didn't consider her one of their own. Humans are afraid. She's tired. And then a mortal appears who, in just over a year, has done what her kind couldn't do in centuries. He forced a dragon to retreat. She's curious how. Dan showed her the workshop, not everything, not the blueprints for the combat machines, but the engine, the wing, the profile. He explained the principle: lift, thrust, control. Siren listened in silence. She touched the parts with her long fingers. She asked questions, smart ones, precise ones. She asked what the Valkyrie's top speed was. Dan didn't answer. She smiled and said she understood. Then she said something strange. She said that dragons have young that can't fly, a disease, a rare one. Their bones grow too dense, their wings can't support them. Such young are usually killed, because a dragon that can't fly isn't a dragon. Siren said this in an even voice, but Dan saw her hands tremble. He asked how many there were now. She said 7. 7 young dragons that their mothers are hiding because if the elders find out, they'll kill them. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he said he could build a glider for a dragon, big enough, with a design tailored to their weight and shape. No engine, just a wing. Thermal currents and updrafts would do the rest. He said that a dragon that can't fly on a glider is still a flying dragon. Siren looked at him. Her vertical pupils dilated. She didn't say anything. She stood up. She left. She was gone for 3 days. On the 4th day, Dan came to the workshop in the morning. A scroll lay on his table, a large one, made of leather. He unrolled it and stopped breathing. It was a drawing, detailed, precise, the anatomy of a dragon, the skeleton, the muscles, the tendons, the points where the wings attached to the shoulder blades, heart, lungs, 2 hearts actually, and notes, in fine handwriting, in human language. The scales are thinnest here. Here is a blood vessel cluster. Here is a blind spot. Here is a nerve ganglion. A strike here paralyzes the wing for 30 seconds. It was a map of all the dragon's vulnerabilities. A gift, or a bribe, or the beginning of something Dan couldn't quite name yet. He rolled up the scroll, hid it, and began drawing a glider for a dragon hatchling. That same day, Celia found something else, in the basement of the old royal library. She'd been rummaging through it for a week at Dan's request, looking for any mention of flying machines, and she found it, a scroll, an old one, 400 years old. The parchment was practically crumbling in her hands. On it was a drawing, rough, childish compared to what Dan was doing, but recognizable. A monoplane with a pusher propeller, signed Master Kell, and below a note in different handwriting, burned along with the workshop by order of the House of Ash. Year 37 of the Red Wing era. Dan held the parchment in his hands and felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He wasn't the first. Someone had already tried, 400 years ago, and he was burned, along with his family, along with everything. And someone went to great lengths to make sure it was forgotten. Celia asked what that meant. Dan said it meant they were on the right track, and that this path was more dangerous than they thought. Master Kell's blueprint wouldn't leave Dan alone. He studied it for 3 nights in a row. The lines were different, a different style, a different school. But the approach was the same. The person who drew it understood aerodynamics, not intuitively, scientifically. A pusher propeller, an upper wing, a tail unit with an elevator. This wasn't a dreamer's drawing, it was an engineer's drawing. Master Kell was a castaway, just like Dan. Someone had pulled him out of another world, or from Earth, or from somewhere else, and that someone had been around for at least 400 years. Dan had told only 2 people about this, Mireille and Alara. Mireille turned pale. She said that the Royal Chronicles mentioned Master Kell. A stranger, he appeared out of nowhere. He spoke an unknown language which he quickly learned. He built strange things. He was accepted at the court of the king of that time, and 2 years later he was burned at the stake, along with his entire workshop, at the behest of the House of Ash. The official reason? Heresy, insolence toward the heavens. The real reason? Fear. Alara listened in silence. Then she said that among the wind mages there is a legend about voices that come from the void, the voices of masters, dying masters, those whose last thought was of their work, of a blueprint, of a detail. The legend says that someone in this world hears such voices and collects them for 1,000 years. Dan asked who. Alara said she didn't know. No one knows, it's a legend. But legends in Aerodyn often turn out to be true. Dan set the question aside, not because it wasn't important, but because a war was looming. Warrencat had gathered his forces. Mireille's intelligence reported that the House of Ash was preparing an attack. Not just 1 dragon, 6. 6 adult combat dragons, plus ground forces, plus spies and saboteurs. The goal? The complete destruction of Valenheim, so that it would never happen again, so that no one would dare to do it in the future. Dan was preparing. He had 6 Valkyries against 6 dragons. On paper it was a tie. In reality it wasn't. A dragon is stronger than a Valkyrie, more durable. Its fire has a range of 100 meters. Its scales can withstand a bolt from a crossbow if it misses its mark. But a Valkyrie is faster in horizontal maneuvers. A Valkyrie can gain altitude faster because it's lighter. And the Valkyrie can shoot more accurately because the pilot aims rather than spitting fire at random. Plus, there's the Siren map. Dan now knew where to strike, the wing root and the nerve ganglion at the 7th cervical vertebra, the eyes, the heart, 2 hearts. If both are pierced, the dragon falls. But it's impossible to pierce the scales over the hearts with a regular bolt. Dan spent 3 nights poring over the blueprints. Then he went to Halvar. He said he needed special bolts. Halvar asked what kind. Dan said armor-piercing ones, with a core made of that very northern steel, hardened to the limit, with a tip shaped not to cut through the scales, but to pry them apart, like a wedge. Halvar listened, then he nodded. He said he'd do it. It would take him a week. Dan said they had 2. Intelligence had given them 2 weeks before the attack. The workshop was running around the clock, 3 shifts. Dan slept 4 hours a day. Yuna brought him food right to his workbench. He ate standing up, eating with one hand while drawing with the other. Celia worked nearby. She traced copies of every blueprint. 3 copies, one in the workshop, one in the palace basement, one for Mireille personally. Dan didn't explain why. Celia figured it out on her own. If he were killed, the blueprints would remain. She didn't tell him she understood. She just made the copies more carefully. Alara trained the pilots, not in the cockpit, on the ground. She explained the wind to them, how it behaves near the mountains, how a dragon's fiery breath creates an updraft in front of it and a downdraft behind it, how to use that. She spoke in a language the pilots understood. No formulas, images, feelings. The wind plays like this. The wind pushes this way. If a dragon breathes fire, go up and to the right because the heat will rise and carry you. Hannah absorbed every word. She and Alara weren't friends, but they respected each other. The kind of respect that develops between people who both risk their lives. 3 days before the expected attack, Dan did something he hadn't planned. He built a glider, a small one, for 1 person. No engine, no automatic firing mechanism, just a wing and a cockpit. lightweight, elegant, and he carried it over to Ilara. He said it was for her. She could take to the air in it, without magic, without blood, just the wind and the wing. He said she deserved it, that the sky belonged to her not because she paid for it with blood, but because she understood it better than anyone else. Ilara stood in front of the glider. She touched the fabric. She touched the control lines. Then she climbed into the cockpit. Dan launched her from the hill, a simple run down the slope. Ilara lifted off the ground. The glider caught a thermal. It rose, higher, higher. She was flying. No pain, no blood, no magic. Just the wing and the wind. 10 minutes, 15, 20. She was flying, and her face was wet. Dan saw it when she passed over him at a low altitude. A wet face, closed eyes, a smile. She landed 25 minutes later, gently, almost perfectly. She climbed out of the cockpit, looked at Dan, said nothing, turned around and walked away. He pretended not to notice that she had been crying. That was between them. 2 days later, Warren Cat arrived, and he wasn't alone. 6 dragons appeared at dawn. Warren Cat led them in a wedge formation, huge, red and black. Its scales shimmered like coal. 5 followed behind him, younger, smaller, but each one was deadly. The capital saw them and froze. People fled to their basements. They shut the shutters. They hid their children. 3 years ago, the ports along the coast had burned just like this. 3 years ago, those who hadn't managed to hide had died just like this. Dan was in the cockpit of the Valkyrie 1 20 minutes before the dragons appeared. Ilara woke him up. She could sense them in the wind by the way the air parted before 6 pairs of wings. The entire squadron took off as a whole. 6 aircraft, 6 pilots. Dan in the center, Hannah on the right, Lyra on the left. 3 cadets in the back. They climbed to 400 meters and headed toward them. Dan saw the dragons on the horizon, 6 dots that grew larger with every passing second, growing and growing. He remembered the first time he'd seen a dragon through a hole in the barn roof. Back then it had been just one creature. Now there were 6 of them, and they were coming to kill. He pressed a button on the instrument panel, a homemade one, connected to a copper tube that ran from his cockpit to a horn on the tail. A primitive communication system. Shout into the tube, the horn amplifies it. The pilots on the right and left hear it. He shouted a single command, in pairs of 2. No head-on. Flanks. Approach from the side. Hannah first. The plan was simple. Don't engage in a head-on battle. The dragon's fire strikes forward. In a head-on attack, there's no chance. So, flank them. Spread out in pairs. Strike from the flanks, from the rear, from blind spots. Hannah and Lyra went to the right, 2 cadets to the left. Dan and the last pilot, named Voight, stayed in the center. A decoy. Dan was heading straight for the Warren Cat. The dragon saw him. Dan was sure of it. Those same eyes, the same gaze. The creature remembered. The creature remembered the bolt in its wing and the blood in the air and the shame of retreat. The Warren Cat broke away from the formation. It went after Dan alone. Personal. This was personal. Dan calculated. Distance. Approach speed. The dragon was faster in a straight line, but Dan had no intention of flying straight. At the last moment, he sent the Valkyrie diving downward, sharply. A dive. The Warren Cat breathed fire. A pillar of plasma swept over the cockpit. Dan felt the heat through the skin. The fabric on the upper surface of the wing darkened, but it didn't catch fire. Yuna and Farron had made a new coating, a fire-resistant one made of clay and alchemical salts. It worked. Dan pulled out of the dive from beneath the Warren Cat's belly. He looked up. He saw the enormous body above him. Scales, paws, tail. And there, between the front paws, where the scales were slightly lighter, where, according to the siren map, both hearts are located. He pulled the lever on the automatic crossbow. 3 of Halvar's armor-piercing bolts shot upward, one after another. 2 out of 3 hit their mark. Dan saw the bolts pierce the scales. He saw the scales part under the wedge-shaped tips. He saw dark blood spurt down onto his visor. The Warren cat made a sound, not a roar, not a scream, a sound of surprise. For the first time in its life, something had penetrated so deeply. But it didn't fall. 2 hearts. The bolts had pierced the scales but hadn't reached the hearts. Too thick a layer of muscle, too short a bolt. Dan realized this instantly. It fell short. Centimeters made the difference. The Warren cat spun around, faster than Dan expected, faster than any dragon he'd ever seen. Young, enraged, fast. The fire came again. Dan dodged, but not completely. The flame licked his left wing. The fabric burst into flames. Even the fire-resistant coating couldn't withstand a direct hit. The left wing was on fire. The Valkyrie began to bank. Dan struggled to control it. The pedals, the stick. The bank angle increased. He was losing altitude. The Warren cat was turning for its third run. Finish it off. And then Hannah came up behind him. She was there, the whole time, waiting, just as he'd taught her. Don't rush into a fight. Wait for the moment. The moment had come. Hannah fired 3 bolts into the base of the Warren cat's right wing, right where the nerve ganglion was, right where, according to the siren's map, a hit would paralyze the wing for 30 seconds. 30 seconds. For a dragon in flight, that's an eternity. Warren cat's right wing went limp. He screamed. This time, a real scream, a scream of pain. He began to fall, tilting to the right, spinning. A massive mass of scales and fury plummeted toward the ground. 500 meters, 400, 300. At 200, the wing sprang back to life. The ganglion had recovered. Warren cat spread his wings. He slowed down, but he didn't take off. He landed, heavily, in a field south of the city, alive but on the ground. The other 5 dragons saw it. They saw their leader fall. 2 of them were already wounded. Hanina's pair and the cadet's flanking pair worked like clockwork. Flanking maneuvers, bolts into the wings, into the necks, into the eyes. 3 of the 5 dragons turned and flew away. The remaining 2 held out for another minute. Then they flew away too. The sky was empty. Dan landed the burning Valkyrie in the field. The left wing was burning out. He cut off the fuel supply. He glided on one wing and a prayer. The impact with the ground was hard. He was thrown forward. The seatbelts dug into his shoulders. His mouth tasted salty with blood. He'd bitten through his lip. But the plane had come to a stop, and he was alive. He climbed out of the cockpit. Valkyrie 1 was burning. His first car. His brainchild. He watched as the fire devoured the canvas and wood. Then he turned south. There, in the field, lay the Warren cat, huge, wounded, on the ground. A dragon that could not take flight. Warren cat lay in a field south of the capital, alive, wounded, on the ground. Around him, within a radius of 300 meters, the royal guard stood in a circle, crossbows at the ready. Spears were stuck in the ground. No one dared to approach. A dragon on the ground is still a dragon. Its fire reaches 100 meters. Its tail shatters walls. Its gaze kills. Not literally, but almost. People lost their will just by looking into its eyes. Dan arrived an hour after the battle. His head was bandaged. His left arm was burned. Yuna applied ointment to his face and arm and told him he needed to rest. He stood up and walked away. Mireille stood on the hill and watched the dragon in the field. Next to her stood Halvar with an axe, Ilara, her face pale, Celia with a notebook. Mireille looked at Dan and said she could order them to finish it off, 1,000 crossbowmen, to rain bolts down on it. Sooner or later something would hit its eye or an open wound. Dan said no. Mireille asked why. Dan said because a dead Warren cat is revenge, but a living Warren cat on the ground is a message to all the dragon houses. We can kill him, but we won't." Mireille was silent. Then she said that messages don't work on those who have no ears. Dan said that one house does have ears, the Azure House, and it wants to talk. Mireille asked how he knew. Dan said that the drawing of a dragon's anatomy on his desk wasn't a gift from the enemy. It was an invitation to talk. Mireille thought for 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the Warren cat in the field twitched. He tried to spread his wings. The right one still didn't obey him completely. He growled, quietly, like a wounded beast. Mireille nodded. She said she'd give Dan a week. If there were no results in a week, she'd order him to be finished off. Dan worked for 7 days, not on a weapon, on a glider, a large one with a wingspan of 12 meters, designed to carry the weight of a dragon hatchling. The frame was made of steel-reinforced ash, double-skinned, controlled via a system of control rods that could be operated with paws rather than hands. He drew and built at the same time. Celia helped, Halvar forged the fasteners, Gren cut the ribs, Ilara calculated the airfoil for a creature that weighs 10 times as much as a human. Yuna fed everyone and didn't sleep. 7 days later, the glider was ready, rough but functional. Dan loaded it onto a cart. He placed 2 boxes next to it. One contained the blueprints, copies for the dragon hatchlings, 7 of them, each with calculations tailored to a specific weight and wingspan. He didn't know the exact specifications for each hatchling, but during that one encounter, Siren had mentioned their general dimensions. He'd extrapolated. In the second box, he placed a bottle, a glass one, containing a liquid he'd been distilling for half a year, from memory, using grain and a homemade still. It wasn't quite whiskey, but it was close. He got into Valkyrie 3, the only one undamaged in battle. He removed the automatic cannon. He removed the bolt mounts. He removed everything that could be used as a weapon. He strapped the crates in place of the automatic cannon, and he flew, alone, toward the southwest, toward the mountains of the Azure House. Hannah wanted to fly with him. He refused. She called him an idiot. He agreed. But he flew alone. A squadron of the 5 remaining aircraft took off after him, at a distance. If anything went wrong, they'd cover his retreat, if they could. Hannah led them. Dan flew for 2 hours. The mountains rose before him like a wall, gray, blue at the peaks, with white caps of ice. The caves of the Azure House were in the upper cliffs. He could see the entrances, dark gaps in the rock, and he saw them, dragons, dozens of them, perched on ledges, on cornices, staring at him. A tiny buzzing thing with canvas wings. Not a single one attacked, not a single one rose to meet him. They just watched. Dan found a landing spot in front of the largest cave, narrow, rocky, a death trap for landing. He landed, by some miracle. The wheels screeched against the rock. The vehicle came to a stop 3 meters from the cliff's edge. He climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were shaking, not from the cold, though it was cold here. Before him was a cave, huge, and light was streaming out of the cave, blue, cold. Siren came out to meet him, not in human form, in her true form. She was enormous, blue. Her scales shimmered like sapphires. Her wings were folded behind her back. Eyes with vertical pupils looked down at him from above. Behind her stood her kind, hundreds of eyes, hundreds of pairs of wings. Silence. Only the wind whistled through the rocks. Dan raised his hands, empty, open, and he spoke. He said he didn't want their sky, that he wanted humans to have their own, that the sky was big enough for everyone capable of reaching it, whether on wings or with an engine. He said he'd brought the blueprints, a glider for their young who couldn't fly. 7 blueprints, each one calculated, each one tested. He said that no child should die simply because they were born different, neither human nor dragon. The siren was silent for a long time. The wind whistled. Hundreds of eyes watched. Then she began to change. She began to shrink. Her scales retreated beneath her skin. Her wings folded and vanished. A minute later, a woman stood before him. Dark hair, vertical pupils, bluish skin. She walked over, sat down on a rock across from him, looked at the crates tied to the Valkyrie. Then she looked at him and said one word. Pour. Dan opened the bottle. He poured into 2 tin mugs he'd grabbed from the workshop. He handed one to her. Siren took it. She sniffed it. She raised an eyebrow. She took a sip. She grimaced. She took another sip. Behind them, the sun was rising. It rose from behind the eastern mountains and bathed the cliffs, caves, and the clearing where a small wooden plane with canvas wings stood in light. And high in the sky, Dan saw 6 dots, 5 Valkyries and 1 glider. Hannah was leading the squadron in circles at a safe distance, ready to rescue him if the conversation went south. And the 6th dot, a glider, no engine, powered only by the wind. It was Ilara. She was flying alone, without blood, without pain, just on the wing he'd built for her. Dan looked at those dots in the sky and drank whiskey with the dragon woman, thinking that the world was strange and cruel and beautiful, and that he wasn't the first to try to change it, nor would he be the last. But maybe he'd be the first to be allowed to finish. Siren finished her mug. She set it down on a rock. She looked at the blueprints, then at Dan, and said she wanted to hear the terms. Dan said there was only one condition: the sky for everyone, whoever is capable of flying. Siren said that was a condition the House of Ashes would never agree to. Dan said the House of Ashes had lost its right to a say when its leader lay in the field by the walls of Valenheim, alive, because people had decided not to kill him. Siren looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said this was the beginning, not the end. The beginning of a long conversation, but a beginning. Dan said he was satisfied with the beginning. He finished his mug. He stood up, walked over to the Valkyrie, untied the crates, set them down in front of the cave. Blueprints and a bottle. Knowledge and friendship. All he had to offer. Siren looked at the crates. Then she raised her eyes to the sky, at the 6 dots circling in the distance. Small, stubborn, alive. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper. She said that Warncat would find out about this meeting, and for the first time in his life, he would feel something that dragons don't feel. Dan asked what. Siren said, fear. Dan got into the Valkyrie. He started the engine. He rolled over the rocks. He broke away from the edge of the cliff and flew home, to the capital, to the workshop, to Hannah, who was waiting for him in the sky and yelling into a copper tube for the whole squadron to hear, to Celia, who was sitting at the drafting table with a pencil behind her ear, to Yuna, who was heating up soup, to Halvar, who was sharpening new bolts, to Mireille, who was clutching a brass compass in her fist and waiting, to Ilara, who was flying alongside him, in her glider, without an engine, without magic, on the wing and the wind. They flew side by side, the machine and the glider, the engine and the silence. A man from another world and a woman from this one. The sky belonged to both of them. And for the first time in 1,000 years, it belonged not only to those with wings,